Today we have John Brasidas, who is a scholar and almost a gentleman, and he is very learned in the northern religions. He comes from Lithuanian background and is very well versed in that information. And both of these heritages lend to the runes. And I would say he is a real master of runic wisdom, although he would not say that. But here's John Brasidas. From where are you sitting now?
I'm in beautiful Mansfield, Missouri, which is where the Little House on the Prairie books were written. So that kind of fixes what this place is in time. It's in southwestern Missouri in the Ozarks.
All right.
Great, and we're going to start with a little bit of an intro to the history and the culture of the runes.
Okay, and let me start with the usual disclaimer, and that is that whenever I say anything, the first thing that you should think is, he doesn't know what he's talking about. And I say that because no one actually knows what they're talking about. Your experiences, your impressions are just as valid as mine. All of this is speculation because the historical sources are very thin. The word rune itself, in its original meaning, means a secret. And it still retains that meaning today in the Scottish version of English, which, by the way, carries a lot of useful information about different pagan subjects because it tends to have preserved many of the old meanings. The runic alphabet itself is not something that we have any written information except archaeological evidence for in the pagan period. The only written source on runes and their use that dates before Christianity is from a tiny little thin book written by Tacitus about the German tribes called Germania. It's maybe about, 20 pages long. And there's one sentence in there that talks about divination with runes, and that's it. It doesn't give us any information of what the runes looked like. It doesn't give us any information as to how they were drawn or used. And basically, it sounds a lot like I Ching divination, that they would write runes on pieces of wood and then throw them on the ground, and from that they were able to make divination. So that's it. And everything else is either written, and most of the sources come from a fairly modern period, say in the 1600s. The oldest ones go back to the 12th century. And there just isn't a lot of solid information there. But we do have this traditional body of knowledge. We don't know how far back it goes. All alphabets, and in English we use an alphabet that ultimately is Phoenician, but it's derived from the alphabet used by the Greeks and Romans. All alphabets originally had magical functions. The ones for the Greco-Roman alphabet are largely lost today. Not so much so with the runic system, which is why we look at it as a source of divination and insight. However, there still is one Greco-Roman, I guess you would call it a bind rune, that's present that everybody knows today. And I don't know, can you see that?
Yep.
It's the RX that starts a prescription. Well, what that actually means, it's an invocation to Jupiter highest and best. And it dates back to a time when a prescription was a magical incantation that was written and placed on the patient. And that's what was going to cure him. And that has been retained in the medical and pharmaceutical professions today. And every prescription still starts with an invocation to Jupiter.
Wow.
Now, was there more? Of course there was more, but it's gone. Okay, in the runes, we still have that kind of knowledge to a certain extent. And of course, what else we have is we have the experiential knowledge of all the people who are working at it. Where did these mystical, magical meanings of the runes come from? Well, of course, they came from the experience of priestesses and other people who were working with them. And one thing Tacitus tells us about the German tribes is that when a woman spoke at one of the meetings of the tribe, she was always strictly paid attention to because all women were believed to have the gift of prophecy. So it's very much in this tradition to accept someone's interpretation of meaning. Another thing I should say is, yes, there is a runic alphabet. The most commonly used one is the Elder Futhark. And by the way, Futhark is a modern innovation. Our name alphabet derives from the first two letters of the Greek alphabet, alpha and beta. All right, somebody studying in the runes, probably I would guess in the 19th century, decided that they had to have a name for the various runic alphabets, but it couldn't be alphabet because that was Greco-Roman and we wanted something northern. So they took some of the first letters in the traditional ordering of the runic alphabet, and thus the word Futhark, which you are free to use or not use. But there are literally hundreds of different runic alphabets, depending on the region of Northern Europe that you're talking about. And they share some similar letters, but they're not necessarily all the same. I think the other thing I should say is that we have been largely ignorant up until maybe about 20 to 30 years ago that runes functioned as a real written alphabet. What we know now is that the reason we have not thought of it as a everyday written language is the materials that writing were done on were perishable. They were mostly pieces of wood or bark. And this isn't the kind of thing that survives in an archaeological context. There happened to be a pier up in Sweden, which sometime in the Middle Ages burned. And as a result, the artifacts got deposited in a environment in which they didn't deteriorate. And so we have a lot of everyday stuff that's written by everyday people, and the materials they recovered ranged from everything from a cheese merchant talking about his trip to try to buy some cheeses and the fact that he was unhappy with the prices he had to pay, to a tablet that was covered with wax and had kind of a ordinary, not very exciting inscription on it. But if you looked underneath the wax, there was a secret message to the effect that the men have all gone away, and if you attack now, you will be successful. So what we're able to guess from this is that ordinary people were literate. They could read and write, which is a real different picture than we normally have. So yes, there was a use as a means of communication. Then there was a secondary use, which probably in that society was never separated from the communication, in that it was a magical system which was used to convey multiple meanings. As a result, runic inscriptions, especially the big monuments that you see carved in stone, are maddeningly difficult to decipher. And the reason is that we're dealing with a culture that loved word games. And so there were multiple meanings and puns and something called kennings, which literally still today in the English version that's spoken in Scotland means to know. I ken you. Well, a kenning is a literary allusion. So for example, if you say the dragon of battle, what you're talking about is a spear. You know, there's all kinds of kennings, and these are incorporated incorporated into runic meanings. Some of these inscriptions can be read like 4 or 5 ways. There's a very famous one where it tells you what the weather was like and the route was taken on a trip, although on its face the inscription just says, you know, Schwen took a trip to Norway. Well, it means a lot more than that. So always be aware that when you're looking at this stuff, there's layers and layers and layers of meaning. Christianity, which came into the North Country right about the first millennium, about the year of 1000, was very hostile to this traditional culture because it was perceived as, correctly I think, as having its foundation in the native pagan religions of the area. And so the church attempted to suppress it with extremely mixed results. One of the most ironic being that several orders of Scandinavian monks persisted in writing runic inscriptions in their monasteries and developed whole new runic systems of writing. But for the most part, the use of these things as a means of communication died out around the year 1000. Did their magical use continue? Well, I think it's reasonable to suppose so, because most of the subsequent interest in runes was in the area of their use as a tool of divination or a tool to work magic in the bind runes. And we'll talk about bind runes later, but a bind rune is basically a magical spell which is made by adding one rune to another, and the patterns can be quite complex, but the idea is basically the same as the RX on the prescription. You're making a magical invocation of some sort. In the 16th century, there was something of a runic revival in Scandinavia, and people began working with them again and writing texts on them. And most of the runic information you have dates from this period. How much of it is old knowledge? We simply don't know. It's reasonable to suppose that at least some of it is. Then once again, with the rise of nationalism after the Napoleonic Wars, there was this emphasis on rediscovering the ancient roots of our culture for various national groups. Now, this is completely false in terms of what these cultures were like. At the time, there was no idea of being a German or being a Swede or being a Norwegian. These were tribe-based societies. But in the 19th century, we became obsessed with, this is the original German culture, this is the original Swedish culture, this is the original Norwegian culture. And there was kind of this absurd and somewhat immature effort to prove that we invented it first. So when you're looking at runic literature, you'll get involved in lengthy arguments as to whether or not they were copying Roman or Greek letters, or the Roman or Greek letters were copying the runes. And of course, it's all just nonsense. One person interested in working magic is going to borrow valid magic from another culture that they encounter. And so there was a tremendous interchange of information. But there wasn't this idea that, this is what we do, and if you cross the river, you're in a Celtic country and you don't use the same. We know to a certain extent that people who were participating in these religions very freely interchanged information. The Romans who wrote this stuff down always attempted to identify a local god with somebody they were familiar with. So, for example, if you were a Roman, you had a real solid understanding of Mercury, and you might find resemblances to a local god and say, oh, well, this is a different form of Mercury. And Tacitus does do that in his book Germania because it gives his Roman audience a reference as to what these gods are like. At the same time, in a pagan system, there's no prohibition against borrowing deities. And if you run into a deity you like, you're going to adopt perhaps the god entirely, or perhaps you're going to add some of his characteristics onto a god that you like. And I haven't looked at it for a while, but I believe that Tacitus identifies the god we call Odin with Mercury, you know, whereas we think of him as more like Jupiter in terms of being a paternal male war god and, you know, involved with knowledge and stuff. At the time, the Romans made the correspondence to Mercury rather than to Jupiter, which is very interesting. And once again, we simply don't know. You know, we could go on and do a whole hour about how these stories came down and the influence of Christianity and the influences of the ruling class who wanted to hear about a particular kind of culture and God. When you earn your living through using violence to control a population, and that's what the nobility did, and they made a dirty little deal with Christianity, and where Christianity supported the kings and the kings supported Christianity, they want to hear about blood and guts and war and killing. And the professional poets who were being paid for this stuff produced what their audience wanted. Now, is this characteristic of the stories that were being told around the hearth in a peasant household? Probably not. The one thing we do know is that the nobility used to make fun of Thor because he was the people's god, you know, and all these clodhoppers out there who, you know, worked with their hands and grew stuff worshiped that god, whereas we're aristocrats, and whereas we're nominally Christian, if we were admitting we had pagan leanings, it would be an aristocratic warlike god like Odin. And how much did they change Odin? No. And there's an example of digression. So somehow we've got to get back to where we were. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the link with 19th century German nationalism and all of this older northern religion stuff. It's important for us to understand that Germany, as a concept, that there ought to be a German nation, is about 200 years old. It dates back to the Napoleonic era. Prior to that, there were a bunch of petty principalities and dinky dukedoms. On the era, on the time of the French Revolution, I believe there were 365 of them. And they were nominally part of something called the Holy Roman Empire, which Voltaire correctly pointed out was neither Holy Roman nor an empire. After the Napoleonic Wars, people like the Brothers Grimm decide that there's got to be something called Germany. And intellectuals start looking for a basis of what this stuff is. It's much like how America as a country got invented after the American Revolution. And one of the things they decided they would use was this older pagan past. And it gets picked up when Germany becomes a country in the 1870s and popularized, and it probably reaches its peak about the time of the First World War. And you have people running around like probably the most famous one is a man with the improbable name of Guido von List, who essentially invented his own runic system. And this was very popular in the First World War period. Some of this stuff gets dragged into the era of the Nazis. and used for their own purposes. And we have to acknowledge that it has been used for bad purposes, but there's nothing inherently in the culture that supports that. You know, it's not back in the pagan era, that kind of culture. But you will run into people who work with it from a white supremacist standpoint, and I think that's got to be acknowledged and opposed. Of course, in the modern period, with the revival of neo-paganism and an interest in feminism and Wicca, there's been a gradual rediscovery of these various northern traditions. And that's what we're working with here. And one of the things that I would urge in our study here is that we keep very much in mind that one of the tools we have in working with this material that's totally absent in an academic sense and totally absent in most of the systems that study it is our experiential work. And that, I think, is part of the unique reclaiming take on this stuff, is actually trying it out and seeing how it works and seeing what results we get. And I believe that this is in the truest tradition of this culture, because this was ultimately experiential. I firmly believe that a woman who was reading the runes had developed her own runes that weren't necessarily part of this alphabet. She was developing her own system of divination. If you read commercial books that are published on the runes, you'll see a lot of models based on tarot. Are these valid? Well, if they are for you, they are, but you don't have to feel bound by them. I guess one thing I'll end with is I get a question when I talk about runes, and it's been published in many different books, that you should never let anyone else handle your runes. And people will ask that question. And my answer to that is, you're a witch. You shouldn't let anybody tell you what you can do with your runes. You have to decide that for yourself.